the smell hit you first, before the mud, before the rats, before the screaming shells that tore the sky apart. It was the smell that announced you'd arrived in hell, a putrid cocktail of human waste, decomposing bodies, chlorine gas, and wet earth so thick you could taste it on your tongue. One British soldier described it as the smell of death itself, mixed with everything rotten you could possibly imagine, then multiplied by 1,000. This wasn't war as the history books tell it. This wasn't about glory or honor or noble sacrifice. This was about 18-year-old boys trying not to lose their minds while living like animals in muddy ditches, knowing that any second could be their last. And the stories they brought back, the ones that were too horrific, too raw, too real for the newspapers back home, those are the stories we're about to uncover today. Welcome to the trenches of World War I, where 4 years felt like 4 lifetimes. And survival was less about bravery and more about sheer, desperate luck. Picture this. It's October 1917, somewhere in Belgium near Passchendaele. You're a 20-year-old private from Manchester, and you've been standing in knee-deep water for 3 days straight. Your boots, those leather boots your mother saved up for months to buy before you left, they rotted off your feet 2 weeks ago. Now you're wearing whatever you could scavenge from the dead, and your toes have turned black from trench foot. You can't feel them anymore, which is probably a blessing, because when you could feel them, the pain was so intense you wanted to scream. But you don't scream. You can't. Because screaming draws attention, and attention in the trenches means death. The trench you're standing in is about 7 feet deep and 4 feet wide. The walls are reinforced with sandbags, wooden planks, and corrugated iron sheets. But they're crumbling. Everything is crumbling. The constant bombardment has turned the ground into a moonscape of craters and debris. Above your head, there's a parapet with sandbags stacked to provide protection from enemy fire. In front of you, maybe 30 yards away, is no man's land. That cursed stretch of devastated earth between your trench and the German lines. It's littered with barbed wire, shell holes filled with poisonous water, and bodies. So many bodies. Some have been there so long they're just skeletons in uniforms, their empty eye sockets staring at a sky they'll never see again. You haven't slept in 72 hours. Not real sleep anyway. You've had those micro sleeps where you drift off standing up, still clutching your rifle, only to jolt awake when another shell explodes close enough to shower you with dirt and shrapnel. Your eyes are hollow, ringed with dark circles so deep they look like bruises. Your hands shake constantly now, even when there's no bombardment. They call it shell shock, though the officers prefer not to talk about it. Some men have been shot for cowardice when really they were just broken beyond repair, their minds shattered by the relentless horror. Let me take you through a typical day in these trenches, because typical is a word that loses all meaning when you're living in conditions that would make a medieval dungeon look comfortable. You wake up, if you can call it waking, about an hour before dawn. This is stand to, the most dangerous time of day. Everyone, and I mean everyone who can still hold a rifle, must man the fire step and face toward enemy lines. Why? Because dawn is when attacks usually happen. The logic is simple. The rising sun will be in the enemy's eyes if they come at you from the east. So you stand there, rifle ready, staring into the gloom, trying to distinguish shadows from shapes, sounds from threats. Your heart is hammering so hard you're sure the Germans can hear it across no man's land. One soldier, Private Arthur Empey, an American who volunteered for the British Army before America entered the war, wrote about these dawn stand-tos with brutal honesty. Your stomach is in your throat. Every sense is heightened to an unbearable degree. A rat scurrying sounds like a battalion advancing. The wind through the barbed wire sounds like whispered German commands. You stand there for an hour, maybe more, knowing that if they come, you'll see the bayonets first, then the faces, then you'll either kill or be killed. There's no middle ground at dawn. When stand-to ends and the sun is fully up, You're released from the fire step, but there's no relief, no sense of safety. Now comes breakfast, if you can call it that. The food arrives in containers called dixies, large metal pots that were supposed to keep things hot but never do. By the time the rations reach your section of trench, usually carried by exhausted runners who risk their lives navigating the communication trenches, everything is cold and congealed. You get a hunk of bread so hard you could use it as a weapon, some questionable meat that's more gristle than anything else, and tea. Always tea. The British Army ran on tea more than ammunition. But here's the thing about eating in the trenches that nobody tells you. You're never alone at mealtime. The rats are there. Oh God, the rats. These weren't your ordinary city rats. These were trenches rats. Bloated monsters the size of cats, fattened on corpses and fearless of humans. They'd crawl over you while you slept, steal food right from your hands, and their squeaking, skittering presence was a constant reminder that you were living in a graveyard. One soldier described waking up to find a rat eating his comrade's face. The man wasn't dead, just sleeping so deeply from exhaustion that he didn't feel it. They killed 17 rats in their section that morning, and by evening there were more. The rats carried disease, of course, trench fever, typhus, and a dozen other infections that could kill you just as surely as a German bullet. But you couldn't stop them. You could kill hundreds, thousands even, and more would come. They bred in the corpses that littered no man's land, in the latrines that overflowed when it rained, in the very walls of the trenches themselves. Some men went mad from the rats alone, convinced they were being consumed alive by an unstoppable plague of vermin. After breakfast, if the bombardment isn't too heavy, you might get assigned to a working party. This is where the real nature of trench warfare becomes clear. For every hour of actual fighting, there were days, sometimes weeks, of backbreaking labor just to keep the trenches functional. You might be filling sandbags, thousands of them, to repair walls blown apart by shells. You might be pumping water, a Sisyphean task if ever there was one, because the water table in Flanders was so high that trenches were essentially ditches carved into a swamp. You'd pump for hours, making barely a dent, knowing that the next rain would fill them right back up. Or you might be on latrine duty. Let me be clear about what this meant, because the sanitized history books skip over this particular horror. Latrines in the trenches were just pits dug at the end of a sap trench, sometimes with a plank laid across for sitting. They'd fill up quickly with human waste, and when they did, someone had to empty them. That someone was you. You'd dig a new pit and fill in the old one, all while trying not to retch from the smell, trying not to slip in the filth, trying not to think about the fact that you were doing this while enemy snipers watched for any target careless enough to expose themselves. One Canadian soldier wrote home in a letter that was later censored. "I've gone from being a bank clerk who wore a pressed suit and tie to work every day, to being a man who shovels shit while shells explode overhead. If you told me a year ago this would be my life, I would have called you insane. Now I'm the one going insane, and shoveling shit seems like the most normal thing in the world." As morning turns to afternoon, the shelling usually intensifies. The Germans had the schedule down to a science, and so did the Allies. Artillery bombardments became as predictable as clockwork, which somehow made them worse. You knew it was coming. You could look at your watch and think, in 15 minutes they'll start. And they always did. The sound of incoming shells is something that defies description. It starts as a distant whistle, almost innocent, like a kettle coming to boil, but it grows, amplifies, becomes a shriek that tears through the air. Then comes the moment of impact, and the world explodes. The concussion from a heavy shell landing nearby can kill you without leaving a mark. Your lungs collapse, your brain hemorrhages, and you drop dead from what they called shell concussion. If you were close but not too close, you'd be showered with dirt, metal fragments, and pieces of whatever or whoever the shell hit. The noise was beyond comprehension. Men went permanently deaf from the bombardments. Others developed a nervous condition where they couldn't stop flinching, even in complete silence. Their bodies had been so conditioned to expect explosions that they never truly relaxed again. During a bombardment, you'd huddle in whatever shelter you could find. Some trenches had dugouts, underground chambers carved into the trench walls, reinforced with timber and sandbags. If you were lucky enough to be near one, you'd crowd in with a dozen other men, pressed together in the darkness, feeling the earth shake with each impact, praying that the next one wouldn't be a direct hit. Because if a shell scored a direct hit on your dugout, they wouldn't find enough of you to bury. You'd just cease to exist, vaporized by high explosives. If you weren't near a dugout, you'd press yourself against the trench wall, make yourself as small as possible, and wait. Some men prayed. Some wrote letters they'd never send. Some just stared into space with dead eyes, beyond fear, beyond hope, existing in a state of numb acceptance. This is how you'd spend hours of your day, every day, for weeks or months at a time, just surviving the shelling. Between bombardments, there was the sniper threat. Both sides had expert marksmen who waited with the patience of hunting spiders for someone to make a mistake. Peek your head over the parapet for just a second. Dead. Hold your hand up to light a cigarette where it could be seen. Dead. The snipers were so skilled that they could shoot cigarettes out of men's mouths, kill someone through the narrow observation slits in the trench walls, or wait hours for a target to present itself. One British sniper claimed over 200 confirmed kills during the war. Think about that. 200 men who woke up one morning, went through their routines, and then simply ceased to exist in an instant because they were careless for a fraction of a second. The psychological warfare of the snipers was almost worse than the killing itself. You never knew where they were, never knew when they were watching. Every movement had to be calculated, deliberate, minimal. Men developed a hunched, scurrying way of moving through the trenches, always staying low, always keeping to the shadowed areas. It changed how you carried yourself even after the war. Veterans could be spotted decades later by that distinctive crouch, that nervous scanning of rooflines and high places. As afternoon faded to evening, you'd begin preparing for night patrol. This is where the war got truly intimate and terrifying. No man's land at night was a different world entirely. A nightmare realm where men crawled on their bellies through mud and corpses to cut wire, gather intelligence, or raid enemy positions. You'd blacken your face with charcoal, check that nothing on your uniform would rattle or reflect light, and wait for full darkness. Then you'd go over the top. That phrase, over the top, has become synonymous with World War I, but most people think of it in terms of massive charges during battles. The reality was that men went over the top every single night on smaller patrols, and these missions were often more terrifying than the big pushes, because on a night patrol, you were alone in the dark with maybe 3 or 4 comrades, crawling through a wasteland where any sound could bring death. Any moment could be your last. One officer, Lieutenant Robert Graves, described a night patrol in his memoir. We crawled forward inch by inch. The mud was so thick it sucked at our bodies, tried to hold us in place. Every few yards we'd have to stop, lying perfectly still, listening. The Germans sent up flares regularly, bright magnesium lights that turned night into day and froze you in place like a photograph. If you were caught in a flare, you'd play dead, become just another corpse in a field of corpses, and pray they weren't suspicious enough to send a machine gun burst into the suspicious corpse just to make sure. Sometimes they did. We'd hear the guns open up, hear the bullets hitting the bodies around us, and wait for the hit that would end us. Night patrols had multiple purposes. You might be sent to cut gaps in the enemy's barbed wire in preparation for an attack. This required special wire cutters and nerves of absolute steel, because the snap of wire could carry across no man's land, alerting sentries to your presence. You might be on a listening patrol, trying to get close enough to the German trenches to overhear conversations and gather intelligence about troop movements or morale. Or you might be on a raiding party, meaning you were actually going to enter the enemy trench system, kill or capture soldiers, and get back before reinforcements arrived. These trench raids were warfare at its most primitive and brutal. Once you were in an enemy trench, you couldn't use rifles. They were too long, too unwieldy in confined spaces. Instead, you used clubs, knives, sharpened entrenching tools, and brass knuckles. It was medieval combat with modern stakes. Men bludgeoned each other to death in the darkness, grunting and struggling in the mud, trying to kill quietly so as not to alert others. The psychological impact of killing a man face to face, close enough to smell his breath and see his eyes widen with the realization of death, that broke men in ways that artillery never could. If you survived the night patrol, you'd crawl back to your own lines just before dawn, filthy beyond recognition, shaking from adrenaline and fear, and report to your officer. Then it would be stand to again, and the cycle would begin anew. This was your life, day after day, week after week, month after month. No leave, no respite, just the trenches and the dying. But I haven't even touched on the worst parts yet. The gas attacks, the medical conditions, the psychological breakdown. The rats were horrifying, the snipers were terrifying, the bombardments were maddening. But there were horrors in those trenches that make all of that seem almost bearable by comparison. Let's talk about gas for a moment, because chemical warfare in World War I was humanity at its most diabolically creative. It started with chlorine gas in 1915. The Germans released 160 tons of chlorine along a 4-mile front at Ypres, and the results were apocalyptic. Chlorine gas is heavier than air, so it sank into the trenches, creeping along the ground like a malevolent fog. It's a yellow-green color, and it smells like a combination of pepper and pineapple, an almost pleasant smell that made its horror even worse. When chlorine enters your lungs, it reacts with the moisture there to create hydrochloric acid. You're essentially being burned alive from the inside. Men's lungs would fill with fluid as their bodies tried desperately to flush out the acid, and they'd drown in their own bodily fluids while coughing up frothy, bloody foam. The first gas attack at Ypres killed 5,000 men and wounded 10,000 more. Imagine watching a wall of greenish fog rolling toward your trench, and knowing with absolute certainty that you're about to die in agony unless you can escape. But where do you escape to? The gas fills the trenches. It pools in the lowest points. Running just means running until your lungs give out. The Allies developed gas masks, crude things at first made of cloth soaked in chemicals, later evolving into the iconic rubber and metal masks with their bug-like eyepieces and filter canisters. But even with a mask, gas was terrifying. You had maybe 15 seconds to get it on once you heard the alarm. The rattling of a bell or the banging on metal that signaled, "Gas! Gas! Gas!" 15 seconds to fumble the mask out of its pouch, pull it over your head, make sure the seal was tight, make sure you weren't breathing in those first fatal lungfuls of poison. Men died because their masks were faulty, or because they were too slow, or because they were sleeping when the gas came and never woke up, and the chemist didn't stop with chlorine. They developed phosgene, which was odorless and even more lethal. Then came mustard gas in 1917, and that was a different kind of evil altogether. Mustard gas didn't kill quickly. It blistered your skin, burned your eyes until you went blind, and destroyed your respiratory system over days or weeks. Men who'd been gassed with mustard would die slowly in field hospitals, their lungs disintegrating, their skin covered in weeping sores, crying out for water, for mercy, for death. Wilfred Owen, one of the great war poets, watched a man die from gas poisoning and wrote, "If you could hear, at every jolt, the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. Obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend. You would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and proper to die for one's country. Owen knew it was a lie. The men in the trenches knew it was a lie. Gas wasn't even the only chemical horror. There was the constant threat of infection from wounds. In the trenches, everything was contaminated. The soil itself was poisonous, fertilized by 4 years of decomposing bodies and soaked with every kind of filth imaginable. The smallest wound could become infected with gangrene, a bacterial infection that turned flesh black and necrotic. Gas gangrene was particularly feared because it progressed with terrifying speed. A small shrapnel wound in the morning could become a rotting, foul-smelling horror by evening. The only treatment was amputation, cutting away the infected tissue before it could spread. Field surgeons amputated thousands upon thousands of limbs during the war, working in conditions that were barely sterile, often by candlelight, with the sound of shells falling just outside their aid stations. Trenchfoot was another constant threat, and it was exactly what it sounds like. Keep your feet wet and cold for days or weeks, and the flesh starts to die. First, your feet swell and turn red. Then they go numb. Then they start to rot. In severe cases, the flesh would literally fall off the bone. Men lost toes, feet, entire legs to trenchfoot. The only prevention was changing your socks regularly and drying your feet. But when you're standing in a foot of water with no dry socks to change into, prevention becomes impossible. Officers would inspect their men's feet daily, and a soldier who let his feet deteriorate could be charged with self-inflicted injury and court-martialed, as if any man would voluntarily allow his feet to rot off. Then there was lice. Everyone had lice. It didn't matter how clean you tried to be, how often you washed. The lice were unavoidable, infesting every uniform, every blanket, every piece of cloth. They'd crawl along the seams of your clothes, and you'd feel them constantly, a tickling, crawling sensation that never stopped. Men would spend hours reading their shirt, picking through the seams and crushing lice between their thumbnails. You could kill hundreds, and by the next day, there would be hundreds more. The itching was maddening, and the bites became infected from scratching. But worse than the discomfort was what the lice carried. Trench fever, a bacterial infection spread by lice, would lay you out with high fever, severe headaches, and bone pain that felt like your skeleton was trying to tear itself apart. It was rarely fatal, but it could keep you out of action for weeks or months. And if disease didn't get you, if gas didn't get you, if snipers and shells and trench raids didn't get you, there was still the greatest killer of all, the big push, the attack. The orders would come down from headquarters, often days in advance, sometimes just hours. Tomorrow at 0600, we go over. Those 5 words carried more weight than any artillery shell. Because when you went over the top in a major offensive, you weren't going on a night patrol with 4 men. You were going with hundreds, sometimes thousands, walking into a storm of machine gun fire that would cut through human bodies like a scythe through wheat. The night before a big push, the trench would take on a strange, surreal quality. Some men wrote letters home, final letters they'd leave with the chaplain or a trusted friend. Letters that began, "If you're reading this, I'm already dead." Others cleaned their rifles obsessively, checking and rechecking their equipment, as if perfect preparation could somehow ward off the bullets that would fly tomorrow. Some prayed, huddled in dugouts with rosaries or Bibles, making peace with whatever God they believed in. Others got drunk on rum rations that officers would distribute liberally before an attack. Liquid courage to dull the terror of what was coming. And some men just sat in silence, staring at nothing, their minds already retreating to some inner sanctuary where the horror couldn't reach them. These were often the veterans, the ones who'd been through it before, who knew exactly what awaited them at dawn. The new recruits, the fresh-faced boys who'd arrived just days ago from training camps in England or France, they still had hope in their eyes. They still believed the propaganda about quick victories and glorious charges. The veterans knew better. The veterans had already seen too many glorious charges end with their friends torn apart on barbed wire, drowning in shell holes, or simply disappearing in the blast of a well-placed artillery shell. Lieutenant Colonel Roland Fielding wrote in a letter to his wife before the Battle of the Somme, "I look at these boys, and I know that by this time tomorrow, most of them will be dead. They don't know it yet. They're excited, nervous, but still fundamentally innocent. By noon tomorrow, the survivors will have aged 20 years. They'll have seen things that will haunt them for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives may be, and there's nothing I can do to prepare them for it. No words exist that can bridge the gap between peace and what they're about to experience." The artillery barrage would begin hours before the attack, sometimes days before. The theory was simple: pound the enemy trenches with thousands of shells, destroy their fortifications, cut their barbed wire, kill their soldiers, and create a wasteland that your infantry could walk across unopposed. The reality was far different. In preparation for the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British fired over 1.5 million shells over 7 days. 1.5 million. The sound was continuous, a rolling thunder that could be heard in London, 140 miles away. The earth shook, windows shattered, and when it finally stopped, when the last shell had fallen and an eerie silence descended over the battlefield, the officers blew their whistles and sent the men over. What they found waiting for them was nightmare made manifest. The German trenches hadn't been destroyed. Oh, some sections had taken hits. Some men had died in the bombardment, but the Germans had built deep dugouts, concrete bunkers 30 feet underground that could withstand anything except a direct hit by the heaviest shells. And the barbed wire, the wire that was supposed to have been cut to ribbons, it was still there. Worse, in many places the bombardment had simply blown it around, tangling it into even more impenetrable barriers, creating mazes of rusty metal spikes that grabbed at uniforms and flesh. So when the British soldiers climbed out of their trenches on July 1st, 1916, walking in neat lines as they'd been ordered, their officers had told them the Germans would be dead or 2 days to fight. What they actually walked into was fully operational machine gun nests, manned by soldiers who'd just spent 7 days in underground bunkers, waiting for exactly this moment. German machine gunner Emil Becker later wrote about that morning. "They came out of the mist like ghosts, thousands of them, walking slowly, almost casually. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. They were walking, not running, not taking cover, just walking across no man's land in straight lines as if they were on parade. We didn't want to fire at first. It seemed like murder, not war, but orders were orders. When the first machine gun opened up, it was like dominoes falling. Entire lines of men just collapsed. They kept coming, kept walking over their dead comrades, and we kept firing. I went through belt after belt of ammunition. The barrel of my gun was so hot it was glowing red, and still they came. It was the bravest and most foolish thing I've ever witnessed." On the first day of the Somme, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, 19,000 dead in a single day. Let that number sink in. 19,000 men who woke up that morning, ate breakfast, checked their equipment, said goodbye to friends, and then ceased to exist. Some were killed instantly by machine gun fire. Others were caught on the wire, hanging like scarecrows, screaming for help that would never come as they were slowly shot to pieces. Some made it to the German trenches and died in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Others fell into shell craters filled with water and drowned. Weighed down by their equipment, their hands clawing at muddy slopes they couldn't climb. The wounded were often the unlucky ones. If you were hit in no man's land and couldn't make it back to your trench, you'd lie there, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, as the battle raged around you. You'd listen to other wounded men crying for help, calling for their mothers, begging for water, slowly dying of blood loss or exposure. The stretcher bearers, those incredibly brave souls who went out during lulls in the fighting to retrieve casualties, they couldn't get to everyone. There were just too many. Some men shot themselves rather than endure the slow agony of dying in no man's land. Others were finished off by soldiers from both sides who couldn't bear to listen to their screaming anymore. Private Harry Patch, who became one of the last surviving veterans of World War I, spoke near the end of his life about carrying wounded men from the battlefield. I picked up a boy, couldn't have been more than 18, with his intestines hanging out. He was trying to push them back in with his hands, kept saying, "Help me, help me." We got him on a stretcher, started carrying him back, and halfway there, he died. Just bled out. I can still see his face. I saw 1,000 dead faces in that war, but his is the one that never left me, because he was just a boy, and he died for nothing. Nothing at all. The Battle of the Somme lasted until November of 1916. 4 months of continuous fighting for a few miles of worthless crater-pocked mud. British and Commonwealth casualties, 420,000. French casualties, 200,000. German casualties, estimated between 400,000 and 600,000. Over 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing for essentially no strategic gain. And this was just one battle. The war would rage on for 2 more years. Between the big battles, life in the trenches settled into that grinding routine of fear, discomfort, and random death. Mail call was one of the few bright spots. Letters from home that connected you to a world that seemed increasingly unreal and distant. But even mail call had its cruelties. Sometimes a letter would arrive for a man who'd been killed days or weeks earlier, and his friends would have to decide whether to send it back or burn it. Sometimes the letters themselves were painful, full of news about life back home that highlighted just how far removed you were from normalcy. Your girlfriend had married someone else. Your father had died and you'd missed the funeral. Your business had failed. Your brother had been killed on another front. The letters were supposed to boost morale, but often they just reminded you of everything you'd lost and might never get back. Sergeant William Pressey wrote in his diary, "Received a letter from Annie today. She writes about the flowers in the garden, about taking tea with her mother, about seeing a moving picture show in London. She asks if I'm eating well and staying warm. I don't know how to respond. How do I tell her that I haven't been warm in 6 months? That I ate a rat yesterday because the rations didn't come through? That my best friend had his head blown off 3 feet away from me, and I can still feel his blood on my face?" I can't tell her these things, so I'll write back about the weather and tell her I love her and hope that when I get home, if I get home, she won't notice that the man who left is not the man who's returning. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms that seem bizarre to outside observers, but made perfect sense in the context of trench life. Dark humor became a survival tool. Men would joke about death, make light of horrific wounds, give gallows humor nicknames to the most dangerous areas of the trench line. There was a spot near Hill 60 that was so heavily targeted by German artillery that it was called Suicide Corner, and soldiers would laugh about having to traverse it, make bets about whether they'd make it across. It wasn't that they didn't care about dying. It was that if you took it all seriously, if you really contemplated the horror of your situation every moment of every day, you'd go insane. So you laughed instead. You laughed at death because it was the only way to rob it of some of its power. Superstitions ran rampant. Men carried lucky charms, refused to light 3 cigarettes from one match because snipers could draw a bead on the 3rd light. developed elaborate rituals around putting on equipment or loading weapons. Some believed that certain officers were lucky or unlucky, that serving under one captain meant you'd survive while serving under another meant certain death. Statistics sometimes backed this up. Some units took disproportionate casualties because their commanders were reckless or incompetent. Other units seemed charmed, surviving battles that should have annihilated them. There was also an unspoken system of battlefield ethics that developed between enemies. In certain sectors, at certain times, there were unofficial truces. Both sides knew that if you left them alone during mealtimes, they'd leave you alone during yours. Snipers wouldn't fire during certain hours. Artillery would avoid targeting aid stations marked with red crosses. These informal agreements were never written down, never officially acknowledged, but they existed. And when they were violated, when some new officer fresh from headquarters ordered a raid during a traditional quiet time, or when artillery accidentally hit a medical facility, the retaliation would be swift and brutal. The men in the trenches understood each other in ways that generals and politicians never could. They were all suffering through the same hell, just from opposite sides of no man's land. The Christmas truce of 1914 is famous. That spontaneous ceasefire where British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged gifts, played football, sang carols together. It's been romanticized in films and books, portrayed as a moment of beautiful humanity in the midst of madness. And it was that. But it was also more complicated and more tragic than the simplified versions suggest. Because after Christmas, after the soldiers had shared cigarettes and stories, learned each other's names, and seen each other as human beings rather than targets, they had to go back to trying to kill each other. Some men refused. They were shot for cowardice or insubordination. Others went back to the killing, but were fundamentally broken by the cognitive dissonance of murdering men they'd laughed with days before. Lieutenant Jeffrey Heinecke, who participated in the Christmas truce, wrote, "I shook hands with a German officer who spoke perfect English. He showed me photographs of his family. His wife was beautiful. His children looked like they could have been my own nephews. We talked about books we'd read, places we'd traveled. For 2 hours I forgot we were enemies. Then Christmas ended, and 2 days later I shot a man who might have been him. I'll never know. The distance was too great to see his face clearly, but I think about it constantly. Did I kill the man who showed me his family? Did some other British soldier kill him? Is he still alive in some German trench, wondering if I'm still alive? The war would be easier if we could keep seeing each other as monsters. But we're not monsters. We're just men who've been ordered to kill each other for reasons none of us fully understand." As the war dragged on, the initial patriotic fervor that had sent men rushing to recruiting stations in 1914 evaporated completely. By 1917, both sides were relying heavily on conscription because volunteers had dried up. The men who'd survived the early years of the war were cynical, traumatized, and deeply skeptical of anything their commanders told them. They'd heard too many promises about one more big push that would end the war. They'd been assured too many times that the next offensive would break through the German lines and bring victory. And every time, the result was the same: thousands dead, a few yards of mud gained or lost, and the war grinding on. Mutinies began to occur. In 1917, sections of the French army mutinied after the disastrous Nivelle offensive. Soldiers refused to attack, though they agreed to hold their defensive positions. They weren't cowards refusing to fight. They were veterans who'd been through hell and recognized that they were being sent to slaughter for no gain. The French High Command responded with mass courts-martial and executions. At least 27 soldiers were shot pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others. Hundreds more were sent to penal battalions or imprisoned. The British didn't see mutinies on the same scale, but discipline was increasingly enforced through terror. 306 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed during World War I for crimes like desertion, cowardice, and falling asleep at their posts. Many of these men were suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD, traumatic brain injury from shell concussion, or complete psychological breakdown. They weren't cowards, they were broken. But the military doctrine of the time had no framework for understanding psychological trauma. If you couldn't fight, you were either a malingerer trying to escape your duty, or a coward who deserved to be shot. Private Harry Farr was executed for cowardice in October 1916. He'd been in and out of field hospitals for months with shell shock, was clearly suffering from severe psychological trauma, and when ordered to return to the front line, he physically couldn't do it. He shook uncontrollably, couldn't speak coherently, was obviously in the grip of a mental breakdown. They shot him anyway. Put him in front of a firing squad of his own comrades, men who'd served with him, who knew he wasn't a coward but simply couldn't take any more. And they shot him. His family carried the shame of his execution for decades, until 1916 when he was finally posthumously pardoned. 90 years too late. The executions weren't even the worst of military justice in the trenches. Field punishment number 1, they called it. A man would be tied to a fixed object, usually a gunwheel or a post, with his arms spread wide, for up to 2 hours a day for up to 28 days. This was done within range of enemy fire. You'd be lashed to a wheel, unable to move, unable to take cover, while shells fell and snipers took potshots. It was torture, plain and simple, designed to humiliate and terrify soldiers into obedience. Men died while undergoing field punishment, killed by artillery while tied helplessly to a post. Others were released with permanent injuries from being bound in stress positions. The officers who ordered these punishments, who signed the execution warrants, who sent men over the top into certain death, they lived different lives than the enlisted men. Not comfortable lives necessarily. Junior officers, lieutenants and captains had the highest casualty rates of any rank because they were expected to lead from the front. But senior officers, majors and colonels and generals, they stayed in chateaux miles behind the lines, sleeping in beds, eating real food, drinking wine, and studying maps that reduced the men in the trenches to coloured pins and casualty statistics. There was a growing sense among the soldiers that the men making decisions had no concept of what those decisions meant in terms of human suffering. General Douglas Haig, commander of British forces, was nicknamed Butcher Haig by his own troops. His strategy was attrition. Grind down the Germans by throwing more men into the meat grinder than they could throw back, regardless of casualties. After the first day of the Somme, when 19,000 British soldiers lay dead, Haig wrote in his diary that the casualties were acceptable and that the battle was going according to plan. Acceptable. 19,000 dead in a day was acceptable. Siegfried Sassoon, a decorated officer and war poet, became so disillusioned that he wrote a public letter denouncing the war and refusing to return to duty. He called the war a war of aggression and conquest, being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. His statement was published in newspapers and read aloud in Parliament. The military could have court-martialed him, but he was too famous, too decorated. Instead, they declared him mentally ill, suffering from shell shock, and sent him to a psychiatric hospital. The message was clear: oppose the war and you'd be labelled insane. But Sassoon wasn't insane. None of them were, not really, not in the traditional sense. What they were was traumatized on a scale that society had no framework for understanding. Shell shock, as it was called then, presented in dozens of different ways. Some men developed uncontrollable tremors. Others lost the ability to speak, struck mute by trauma. Some had nightmares so severe they couldn't sleep, would wake up screaming, thrashing, reliving bombardments and attacks. Others became emotionally flat, unable to feel anything, walking through life like automatons. Some became violent, flying into rages at the smallest provocation. Others withdrew completely, staring blankly at walls, unresponsive to the world around them. The medical establishment struggled to understand shell shock. Some doctors believed it was physical damage caused by the concussive force of explosions, that the brain itself was being injured. Others thought it was purely psychological, a weakness of character or will. Treatments ranged from rest and counseling, which sometimes helped, to electroshock therapy, which was torture dressed up as medicine. Men were given painful electric shocks as a way to motivate them to get better, the theory being that the fear of electrocution would overcome their psychological symptoms. It didn't work. It just added more trauma on top of existing trauma. What made shell shock particularly insidious was that it could strike anyone at any time, regardless of courage or experience. Some of the bravest soldiers, men who'd earned medals for valor, men who'd gone over the top dozens of times without flinching, would suddenly break. There was a limit to how much horror the human mind could process, and everyone had a different limit. Once you reached it, there was no predicting what would happen. You might freeze in the middle of a battle. You might walk in circles muttering to yourself. You might eat your rifle barrel and pull the trigger. Suicide was common, though it was rarely recorded as such. The military didn't want statistics on how many men were killing themselves, so suicides were often classified as accidents or combat deaths. A man who shot himself in the head would be reported as killed by enemy fire. A man who walked into no man's land and let himself be shot would be listed as killed in action. The stigma of suicide was so great that families would rather believe their son died heroically than know he killed himself because he couldn't endure another day. And then there were the men who survived physically intact but were utterly destroyed psychologically. Men who made it home but brought the war with them. They'd sit in rooms that were too quiet and panic because quiet meant something was wrong, meant an attack was coming. They'd dive for cover when a door slammed, convinced it was incoming artillery. They'd wake up at night, not in their beds, but crouched in corners, disoriented and terrified. They'd look at their children and feel nothing, all emotion burned out of them by years of trauma. They'd drink themselves to death trying to forget, or drift from job to job unable to hold down work, or end up homeless and broken, begging on street corners with signs that said, "War Veteran." Society didn't know what to do with these men. There was no Veterans Administration in 1918, no PTSD diagnosis, no framework for helping traumatized soldiers reintegrate. You were expected to simply get over it, move on, be grateful you survived. If you couldn't do that, if you continued to struggle, you were seen as weak or ungrateful. Many veterans never spoke about their experiences, not because they didn't want to, but because when they tried, civilians couldn't comprehend what they were describing. How do you explain the smell of gangrene to someone who's never experienced it? How do you convey the sound of a man drowning in his own blood to someone who's only known peace? You couldn't, so veterans stopped trying. They carried their trauma in silence, and it ate them alive from the inside. The war finally ended on November 11th, 1918, at 11 in the morning. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. An armistice was signed, and across the Western Front, the guns fell silent. After 4 years, 1,568 days of continuous combat, it was over. 10 million soldiers dead, 21 million wounded, millions more dead from disease, starvation, and the countless indirect effects of the war. An entire generation decimated. And for what? The Treaty of Versailles would plant the seeds for an even more devastating war just 20 years later. In the trenches, when word of the armistice came, the reactions were muted. There was no wild celebration, no cheering or dancing. The men who'd survived were too exhausted, too traumatized, too numb to feel much of anything. Some cried, some just sat in silence, others walked into no man's land. seeing it without the threat of death for the first time, looking at the devastation they'd lived in, the bodies they'd stepped over, the wire that had caught so many dying men. Lieutenant Rudolf Binding of the German army wrote in his diary on November 11th, "It's over. We should be joyful, and yet there is no joy, just emptiness. I look at the men around me, and I see ghosts. We are all ghosts now, neither fully alive nor fully dead, suspended in some grey space between the world we left and a world we can never truly return to. The war may be over, but for us it will never end. We will carry these trenches inside us forever." And he was right. The men who survived the trenches carried them forward into marriages and careers and ordinary lives that never felt quite real after what they'd experienced. They flinched at loud noises. They couldn't stand the smell of certain chemicals. They had nightmares that made them afraid to sleep. They looked at their peaceful surroundings and felt like imposters, like they were pretending to be normal humans when really they were something else, something broken and remade in the crucible of industrialized slaughter. The trenches of World War I weren't just physical locations. They were psychological spaces that redefined what it meant to be human, that pushed men beyond any reasonable limit of endurance, and that left scars on an entire generation that never truly healed. This is what life was really like. Not heroic, not glorious, just survival. One horrific day at a time, in the mud and blood and madness of the Western Front. These are the stories they didn't tell, until now.